There's a very typical and prevalent mistake I think everyone, or at least most of us, make at the very beginning when we embark on the spiritual journey. And that is related to a paradox which is at play. And because when we fall into this trap, what we're doing is really we are turning this spiritual journey into its opposite, basically. It becomes a journey downwards instead of a journey upwards. If that is in any way interesting to you, well, then whoopee fucking do. So there's this paradox related to growth, right? And it is to want to grow very easily and very often springs from some kind of dissatisfaction with yourself, right? And herein lies the problem, because when you're trying to grow from a place of dissatisfaction, it means there are elements of your own personality that you have not accepted, right? That you are actually in a way fleeing from, that you're trying to get away from, and you're using growth as your vehicle to get away from this, whatever it is, this lower, more embarrassing version of yourself. But it represents a problem, right? Because you can't really grow unless you first accept who you are, right? Because if you don't, it basically comes down to the fact that resistance breeds persistence, right? And so if you are in resistance with those lower parts or those more unwelcome parts of yourself that you want to outgrow, if you don't accept them first, you're going to be clinging to them behind your own back, and they're going to come with you on your spiritual journey. Instead of transcending them, they're going to be coming along as stowaways, and they're going to infiltrate your practice, and they're going to turn it into its opposite. And so it is very important to understand this point about growth, that we must find a way of doing it which is not in opposition or in some kind of antagonistic relationship to the parts of ourselves that we like to hone or enhance or outgrow or transcend or whatever we want to do. And it's related to the fact that growth on the deepest, like, archetypal level is really a form of death and rebirth. And that's how we end up in the situation where we're kind of, as a culture, caught in this grand paradox, right? Everybody wants to grow, but nobody wants to change, because the ego is this conservative element of our identity, and it uses our present perceptome, our present frame of mind, our present reality tunnels, our present ways of understanding and interpreting reality. It uses these elements in stabilizing and scaffolding its non-existent identity, and therefore any idea of change appears as a threat to the ego, because it appears to the ego as what it actually is, which is a death and rebirth. And the ego doesn't want to die, and part of, like, we don't want to die, we don't want the transformation, we're scared to go into the chrysalis. And this, I guess, can lead to a bunch of different missteps in the practice, but one of the essential ones, the one I want to focus on today, is what it does to our ego when we embark on a journey of transformation. What the ego will do to these sides of ourselves that we're trying to outgrow is it will inherently, inevitably try and disown them, right? And that means avoid taking ownership of these aspects of ourselves, our character flaws and the less attractive elements of our personality and identity. And that is the whole problem. That is where we get stuck. When we disown these elements of ourselves, we're not outgrowing them. We're pretending that they're not part of us, right? And then it transforms what could have been growth into a performance, right? It leads us, it's like we come to a fork in the road, and instead of taking the path of growth, we take the path of a more performative denial approach, in which we, instead of outgrowing these elements of our personality, now that we declared, or the ego declared, war on them and disowned them, we're basically just trying to pretend that they're not there, which, yes, is the opposite of growth. And for this reason, it is of absolutely crucial importance to understand that humbleness is the true passport to transformation and spiritual development. If it is not done from a position of humbleness, it will inherently, I would argue, become perverse in some form or another. And the obvious example is, of course, these elements of ourselves that we want to outgrow. Can we muster the humbleness to actually accept that these elements are parts of us instead of just like taking refuge in arrogance and trying to pretend that they're not part of our personality? In a sense, if you want to grow, like inherently in growth is an awareness of something you want to outgrow, of problems, of unbeneficial, unhealthy patterns, all that good stuff. And unless you can muster the humbleness, not only to acknowledge that these elements are there, but I would argue for spiritual growth to really be powerful, you have to master the art of making love to your shortcomings, making love to all those little embarrassing parts that you're looking at and you're like, I should outgrow this. This is maybe immature. I could handle these kinds of situations in a more mature, more healthy, more long-sighted way. And so unless you really learn to love discovering these shortcomings and character flaws, getting a kind of a spiritual kick out of identifying some unhealthy pattern in your behavior or personality, unless you do that, chances are, I would say, overwhelming that you're not going to outgrow them, but that you're going to end up in this performative circus instead, which is a trap leading to things like spiritual pride, spiritual bypassing, and that is just so much of the spiritual, so-called spiritual community is saturated with this kind of fake performative spirituality because the foundations of humbleness are not set. So if you embark on a spiritual journey and you do it from a position of unwillingness and unreadiness to see your own shadow, then you have already established it as a theatrical exercise in which what appears on the surface is the important thing. And so you've created the perfect conditions for all your character flaws and inner ghouls to run rampant behind this performative surface, and thus doomed the journey from the beginning. And one final element I would argue or add to this list of things you have to be prepared for on a wholesome and healthy spiritual journey, on a real, I would say, on a real and not a fake spiritual journey, is also to understand that enlightenment is not something that you will ever achieve. The person who says they are enlightened are definitely not enlightened. And then we're back to the humbleness, right? And so stop clinging to enlightenment as some weird state that you want to conquer and kind of keep for yourself or cling to. Just understand that it's a continuous journey upwards. And if you ever think you've arrived, you know you haven't. Furthermore, I would say that